I'm going to try my best to make a case for critical thinking, because I need your help. I can't do this alone. So put on your thinking caps and bear with me for a while. For the last 30 years, in both the private and public sectors, I've been teaching people how to evaluate and analyze information and how to reason better about complex problems. I've been educating students of all ages about science, critical thinking, and skepticism, and professionally consulting corporate executives and their staffs on how to become more effective decision makers. And I want to share my knowledge and experience with you. Think of me as a thinking coach or a reason coach. The single most important skill we can learn and improve upon in life is how to think better and more systematically. Consistently thinking better affects every aspect of our lives, and yet there are so few resources out there that actually teach us how to think and evaluate claims. I want to present you with a set of heuristics, or cognitive shortcuts if you will, a few simple intellectual principles and values, a critical thinking toolkit if you will, that will help you become a better thinker and a more intellectually honest person. For example, understanding and integrating the logic behind the null hypothesis, the burden of proof, and Occam's razor alone can make you a better thinker. Learning a bit of simple logic, like informal and formal fallacies, can help you quickly identify flawed reasoning. Learning a bit about formal syllogisms can help you construct and deconstruct arguments. Learning more about cognitive biases teaches you about all of the ways that our brains trick us. Learning about different types of reasoning, like abduction, induction, and deduction, will allow you to better understand probabilities. Learning the difference between belief, knowledge, and truth, and the different forms of evidence and justification will better inform your sense of confidence and certainty. Critical thinking also requires embracing certain shared and noble values, like intellectual integrity, fair and open-mindedness, intellectual courage, confidence in reasoning, intellectual perseverance, intellectual humility, intellectual autonomy, and intellectual empathy. If you apply your new critical thinking skills only to ridicule others or to feel intellectually superior or morally righteous, you're doing it wrong. Intellectual snobism is not the goal, but that's rather a betrayal of all the values of critical thinking. And here are some other things that you'll need to learn to avoid: egocentrism, sociocentrism, unwarranted assumptions, wishful thinking, and relativistic thinking. If there were a critical thinking mantra, I might propose the following candidate: question thoroughly, assert with caution. Thinking is a skill, and like any skill, it can be developed over time and with practice. Thinking well has always been a valuable commodity, but we now live in the information age, a time where being a skilled and critical thinker has arguably never been more important for our collective and individual well-being. We all need to develop better means to know what to focus on, what to filter out, and how to evaluate the constant bombardment of truth claims that we encounter every day. And to cite a cliche, it's not so much about learning what to think or simply to memorize arguments, but rather about learning how to think. Truth claims come in all shapes and sizes and ultimately reduce to assertions about the nature of reality, about what is true and what is not, about what exists and what does not, about what is beneficial and what is harmful, and about what you should and shouldn't do or believe. They are ideas about how the universe works, how individuals and societies flourish or suffer, and most importantly, they inform our beliefs, our moral and political philosophies, and our overall worldview. From a societal perspective, if we can't agree on even the most basic and least controversial of fact claims, as is increasingly the case these days, confusion, conflict, and tribal chaos are inevitable. The laws of physics have no bias toward any one particular ideology, so it's very important that we can find agreement on at least the things that we can reasonably claim to know. Ideas matter because they can have profound behavioral consequences. We should want better ideas to win and worse ideas to lose. If we can't discern between good and bad ideas, we risk not only being repeatedly exploited and duped by the ill-informed, self-interested, and dishonest, but also fundamentally misunderstanding cause and effect, which inevitably leads to poor decision-making in our everyday lives. And in case it is not apparent, ideas are not people. Ideas, beliefs, and opinions don't have rights. Only people have rights. We can both respect the rights of an individual and challenge the veracity of ideas at the same time. These are not mutually exclusive values. They can even be mutually supportive. We should care enough about each other to not want bad ideas to pollute otherwise good brains. Despise the idea, not the person. Critical thinking is not simply some vague or esoteric philosophical conversation about intellectually debating the meaning of life, the correct interpretation of quantum mechanics, or the distinction between mind and brain. It's about a practical skill that impacts on every decision you make, whether it concerns your values, your health, your nutrition, your relationships, your career, or your purchasing and investment decisions. So more than 10 years ago, I quickly came to realize that science literacy, critical thinking, and skepticism were dangerously lacking in our societies, and that we needed proponents of reason to enter into the public conversation and help people learn how to evaluate information better. What the world needs most right now is not only more critical thinking education, but also more ethical individuals and leaders who are willing to stand up to promote reason, even if it entails personal or professional risk-taking. So I decided to volunteer my time for free to try to do my part to counter the online misinformation, disinformation, and downright nonsense that is constantly paraded around as fact or truth on the internet and social and mainstream media. It began in part as an effort to debunk and refute the most common unsupported pseudoscientific, anti-scientific, superstitious, supernatural, and conspiracy theory claims, in addition to teaching general science and philosophy literacy. So questions like, is the Earth spherical or is it flat? Did biology come to be as a function of emergent chemistry or as divine creation? Are GMOs safe to eat? Is the climate warming and are we largely responsible? Are vaccines the best and safest way to combat certain diseases? Did we go to the moon or not? Is Elvis alive and living in Argentina? Do ghosts, spirits, fairies, angels, and aliens exist? And do they come to visit us from time to time? Seeing how much disagreement there is on these seemingly easy questions provides a few sample case studies to understand the scope of the problem. And that is only a tiny subset of claims where tens and hundreds of millions of people across the globe come down on the wrong side of the evidence and reason. And if you've ever had an online debate, it becomes quickly obvious that providing evidence or well-reasoned arguments are not sufficient to address this problem. Telling people that they're wrong is not sufficient. The problem is far more fundamental. To quote Sam Harris, water is 2 parts hydrogen and 1 part oxygen. What if someone says, well, that's not how I choose to think about water? If someone doesn't value evidence, what evidence are you going to provide to prove they should value it? If someone doesn't value logic, what logical argument could you provide to show the importance of logic? To make this worse, as fast as we try to put out irrational fires, 10 new ones begin to blaze. Unreason often wins, and it can propagate like a plague. Moreover, once you learn about how we have evolved, you begin to understand the scale and ultimate source of the problem, our brains. Without better and more informed critical thinking, technology, like the internet, for example, becomes not the much heralded and glorious encyclopedia of human knowledge, available to everyone and capable of improving all of our lives, but rather a mass graveyard where brains and logic go to die. A place where every self-serving, dishonest opportunist, marketer, politician, entrepreneur, and snake oil salesman can convince people of anything. Type anything you wish to believe on Google. There will likely be tens of thousands of sources available to serve up your daily dose of confirmation bias. And this is where the idea of a post-truth era begins to resonate and seems to supersede and even cancel out all the promised virtues of this information age we all live in. An age of runaway relativism where all bets are off and anything goes, where expertise loses all value, knowledge becomes arbitrary, and we find ourselves in a state that you'd expect to find only in an Orwell book or the fictional account of Idiocracy. Becoming a better critical thinker requires a mindset change as well as a lot of practice. We're just too used to thinking in the same way that we always have, trusting only our gut and intuitions, presuming to know things that we've never rationally interrogated, and believing things for less than good reason. We all need to learn how to consistently ask ourselves certain types of questions until it becomes automatic and just a standard part of our thinking routine. Now, the fun part is that you get to learn a lot of useful science and philosophy in the process, and maybe even impress your friends at parties or become a more interesting person. For example, here's a bit of science. We've come to understand that our brains evolved to conserve finite energy, and as we're confronted with thousands of decisions a day, we generally prefer simple, quick answers to complex ones which require more cognitive resources, reflection, and effort. That sort of quick and simple cognition is great when you're walking across a street and a car comes at you, when predators are chasing you down on an open plain, or when choosing which line to get in at the supermarket or post office, but not necessarily very useful when evaluating more complex decisions. Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel laureate, might call this type 1 thinking. This sort of knee-jerk, reflexive method of thinking often results in irrational and less than optimal decision-making. It turns out that we're just not very good at instinctively intuiting things like probabilities. We tend to reduce all claims to binary terms and engage mostly in black and white thinking. And when we're dealing with complex decision-making, it's all about evaluating large numbers and essentially doing complex statistics in our head. We didn't necessarily evolve to rationally comprehend or be able to engage reasonably with really large numbers. The universe is a very big place. A lot of things happen. So I've coined a useful heuristic, which I refer to as probabilitarianism, to remind us that many, if not most, claims are not binary at all, and they require a complex weighting and analysis of multiple variables. Our focus should be getting better at deliberate, evidence-based, and reasoned critical thinking, what Kahneman refers to as type 2 thinking. Most of our thinking is done without necessarily being analytical, critical, or skeptical at all, which results in too much of our cognition being largely unconscious and driven by so-called gut feelings, emotion, and our limited experiences. While we are all naturally skeptical of many things, we are predisposed by evolution to believe rather than to disbelieve. Disbelief found our ancient ancestors out of the gene pool pretty quickly. We now live in a world without that same level of moment-to-moment existential angst or mortal threats. For those cases where a claim is binary, there are two ways to be wrong: to believe what isn't likely to be so, what is called a type 1 cognition error or a false positive, and to disbelieve that which is more likely to be so. This is called a type 2 error or a false negative. So what are the sorts of questions that we should be asking, and what is a truth claim? What and who should we believe or disbelieve? Can we know things at all? And how much confidence can we have when we claim to know things? Which authority figures and sources are more trustworthy than others? What are the different forms of evidence and which are more reliable? These are just some of the questions that we need to answer before we are even confronted with any particular truth claim. The answers that we derive from those sorts of questions ultimately reflect on how critical and independent we can be as thinkers. The easiest way to avoid critical thinking, and the path most frequently taken, is to simply accept what others tell you, uncritically. I want to teach you how to identify and evaluate any and all truth claims critically, to learn how to differentiate between a fact, a scientific theory, an unsupported hypothesis, legitimate expertise, evidence-based and well-rounded, well-reasoned positions, as opposed to misguided, albeit passionate, opinions, charlatanism, conspiracy theories, pseudoscience, and self-interested opportunism, to recognize fallacious and motivated reasoning, to quickly spot pseudo-intellectualism, sophistry, word salad, and what Dan Dennett might call deepities, and empty feel-good platitudes, to recognize the telltale signs of overt dishonesty and nonsense, and finally, to apply a consistent and repeatable critical mindset with a set of dependable methods and tools and the heuristics of science, critical thinking, and skepticism. In a word, reason. I want to teach you how to reason better. And if you don't think reason is important, try to not use it when making your case. You might notice a problem there. It's important to learn more about how your brain works and how it constantly tricks you into a false sense of confidence and unwarranted certainty. Coming to grips with and accepting how it is that your brain does this reflectively and instinctively is one of the first crucial steps towards becoming a better and more honest critical thinker. First, think critical about your own beliefs, then be critical of the beliefs, tribes, and sources that you already have confidence in. Then, and only then, be critical of those ideas and groups that you already disagree with. It's easy to be critical of things you already disagree with. Most of us focus far more on what we already disagree with. That's the easiest form of critical thinking. And almost everyone likes to think that they are already a critical thinker. But most of us fail, most of the time. I've been writing about and teaching science and philosophy for the last decade to tens of thousands of people on my website as the Scientific Skeptic and my Facebook forum, Science, Critical Thinking, and Skepticism, which now boasts well over 100,000 subscribers and has spawned hundreds of other similar pages and forums. I want to share our knowledge and what we've learned with you and help you get better at cogitating. And that's really just a fancy word for thinking, by the way. As a fitness coach might say, the old adage of no pain, no gain is no less true when it comes to thinking. It takes a lot of effort, and you will only get out of it what you put into it. It takes practice, like any other skill. But I warn you in advance that becoming a better critical thinker is a thankless job, because no one likes having their beliefs challenged, and no one more so than you. But it's a necessary and noble task to aspire to. We'd have never made progress had we not challenged unsupported, cherished beliefs and bad ideas. We'd still be burning witches to try to cure disease, and sacrificing babies hoping to improve crop output and stopping droughts. The goal is simply to become a better thinker. If your expectation is to become a great thinker, you'll be saddled with the task of needing to learn everything there is to know. And I mean that quite literally. You'll need to learn every scientific and academic discipline, from physics, chemistry, and biology, to psychology, political science, and economics. You'll also need to learn everything about philosophy, like mathematics, logic, linguistics, moral philosophy, ethics, aesthetics, etc. And you'll need to learn everything about history. Otherwise, you have no benchmark. You have no way of evaluating human progress and how we even got here. So maybe the most important thing to accept is that you'll never be a perfect thinker. We're all ignorant and will remain so to the vast majority of knowable things. We're riddled with cognitive and emotional shortcomings and biases. And that, my friends, should make us all far more responsible, humble, and forgiving. This critical thinking exercise sounds rather daunting, don't you think? But don't worry, I'll give you some better news in a minute. And if you're really not interested in intellectualism or learning how to become a better thinker, I understand. It's a never-ending project, and it's really hard. Moreover, it's likely that people will call you arrogant, a know-it-all, intolerant, elitist, and erudite, if you get really good at it. And who needs that, right? But if you forsake the exercise of trying to become a better thinker, you will have to deal with the consequences of being gullible, naive, avoidably ignorant, and constantly exploited by other humans who do not have your best interests in mind and understand your cognitive failings better than you do. You'll be subject to all of the negative consequences of unreasonable and indefensible beliefs, experience the dissonance of an internally incoherent and self-contradicting philosophy, and you will hold unproductive, or even harmful values that you've never reasonably scrutinized. You risk adopting and accepting new bad ideas, beliefs and values, denying evidence-based and more reasonable ideas, making poor purchasing decisions, being constantly conned, duped, lied to, and deceived. You won't know what to eat, when to see a doctor, who to believe, who to be cautious of, who to ignore, and who to avoid. You won't know the difference between good sources of information and poor sources. Now, for the good news. Having taught and studied critical thinking, I witness every day that brains do and can change and improve, that we can all become much better critical thinkers, and that does not necessarily require needing to know everything about everything. I have found that if you acquire a solid foundation in formal reasoning, critical thinking, and scientific skepticism, you can develop a high level of ability to quickly filter through information and to discern what is more likely important and probable, and avoiding nonsense, misinformation, propaganda, sophistry, deception, dishonesty, and all sorts of other poor truth claims. So who am I, by the way, and why should you listen to me? Well, I'm really no one special, and maybe you shouldn't listen to me. But here's a bit of background anyway. I've been a student of human nature and science my whole life. I've spent the better part of 50 years trying to understand how we tick and what sort of a universe we live in that affords us the opportunity to tick at all. After acquiring 2 master's degrees and a Bachelor of Science with a background in economics, political science, and philosophy, international law, war and peace, diplomacy, and systems theory, I consulted at several United Nations agencies in Switzerland before moving into the private sector, where I then began consulting for international and Fortune 500 companies for the last 2 decades. In addition to my academic and professional background, I've spent most of my free time over the last 20 years reading as much as I can across all the scientific and philosophical disciplines, trying my best to acquire more knowledge about the nature of reality from what I consider to be the most influential scientific and intellectual minds our species has ever produced. I want to share what I've learned with you, and for you to teach me what you have learned. After all, we stand on the shoulders of giants. I stand on the shoulders of other skeptics, scientists, and philosophers who came before me, like Sagan, Novella, Shermer, Randi, Dawkins, Harris, Dennett, Hitchens, and hundreds more. And they stood on the shoulders of Hume, Descartes, Aristotle, and thousands of others. And our efforts on SCTS have spawned hundreds of new skeptic and reason sources who continue the tradition. So what have I learned about human nature? Well, I've concluded that we are a paradox and an enigma, a contradiction in so many ways. We are, however, a fascinating specimen, albeit largely an irrational one. Our evolution as a highly intelligent social animal seems to have selected more for traits that promote cognitive consonance, a satisfying and self-serving internal narrative, more than traits that attempt to resolve dissonance and ignorance. That is to say, social adaptability and creative storytelling reigns supreme over reason, the pursuit of objective knowledge, and dare I say it, an effort to find the truth. Our highly advanced problem-solving cognition is primarily geared towards social intelligence, not intellectual intelligence. Intellectual intelligence is a secondary adaptation and only useful to the extent that it promotes acquiring the means to survive, finding a suitable mating partner, ensuring social benefits, status, and acceptance from others like us. We are capable of love, hope, empathy, kindness, altruism, cooperation, and maybe most importantly, reason. Unfortunately, we also fear and hate what we don't understand and anything we perceive as a threat to our well-being or need for consonance. We see, hear, and feel what is the most self-serving. Our brains create a sense of internal coherence, even where there is none. I think our saving grace and greatest virtue is, however, our ability to reason, and I think we need to promote it above all else. I want to share and promote public intellectualism, and I need your help. It's not an easy exercise trying to bridge the gap between our limited individual experiences and ignorance and our best, greatest human knowledge. There is an idea referred to in philosophy as dangerous knowledge, whereby exposing people to something without the necessary prerequisite understanding can not only backfire, but also be taken out of context and can even be used to dangerous ends. I think that's true, and that makes it that much more important that we educate people on the prerequisites. Critical thinking is central to that foundation. In the end, I think we are all layperson scientists and philosophers. I think it's part of our nature to inquire and to problem solve. We all ultimately have our own philosophy or worldview, even if most of us can't necessarily identify or enunciate it very well. I also want to help you identify and develop your personal philosophy and to practice the continuous interrogation and modification of your views in order to learn how to notice internal inconsistency and contradictions. I think the quest to acquire a comprehensive and internally consistent philosophy is the height of intellectual aspiration. My job is not to tell you what to believe, but rather to help you determine it for yourself in a systematic, repeatable, and rational fashion. I want you to become an intellectual badass, and then I want you to pay it forward and help others become one as well. I'm counting on all of you. We need all brains on deck if we are to work together towards solving complex problems and making the world a better place for future generations. I'm the scientific skeptic. Reason warriors unite.